Ons gesels môre met die outeur John Laband en spesifiek oor die boek The Boer Invasion of the Zulu Kingdom wat nou onlangs uitgekom het, 'n stukkie briljante akademiese navorsing en ek moet vir jou sê, dit maak my soms warm onder die kraag. Morning, John.
Good morning.
So I read this book and I thought, it's impossible. It can't be like this. This was not what I was taught. No one told me this. And I put the book down and I walked away. And a couple of hours later, I think, maybe it's not the book. Maybe it's me.
I know. I mean, I've had people the response, "This is rubbish. I hated the book. Throw it away." But then, of course, this is not the old story, not what we are told. It's more what really happened, and what I've tried to do. I mean, certainly. I mean, when I was young, one was taught purely from the, if you like, the settler perspective.
Yes.
Now there's an entirely different one. I mean, here are the Zulu people. Here are people who arrive to settle on their land, uninvited, and there's a response. And one must look at it that way to understand the thing in a much more rounded kind of perspective. Yeah.
John, how do you stay completely objective when writing a book like this? Because I suppose there would be so many emotions, and so how do you make sure you are completely objective when you write a book like this?
Well, look, no historian is absolutely objective. I mean, you are somebody, you come from your place, but I'm not a Zulu, I'm not an Afrikaner. The British, of course, play a large part in this, but then it's on the side, so I'm not really sort of involved with that. So I find I can actually look at it more as an outsider. I mean, I was brought up in South Africa. I'm a South African, but still, I'm not absolutely invested, if you like, in the mythologies of any one side or the other.
It's interesting you say the mythology of it. A lot of the history, especially about the voortrekkers, or as they were actually called, the immigrant farmers.
Immigrant farmers, yeah.
Later they became known as the voortrekkers.
Yeah.
A lot of the history of the immigrant farmers was told from the perspective of the settlers themselves for decades and decades and decades. And to the extent that till today, that is the viewpoint most people have of the so-called groot trek, which wasn't an organized groot trek, actually. It was
it's a whole lot of small parties moving in,
Yes.
But I mean, it's just the same as the movement, say, in America across the American continent into the West. I mean, displacing the Indians there as well. I mean, it's a process you see in many parts of the world where settlers arrive and push. And I mean, this is not just in the wider world. I mean, there's settlers that have moved across Europe, hundreds of years ago and all the rest of it. So it's a very common process, but there's always victims at the other end. There are people living there, and these people suddenly find they've been pushed aside or turned into servants or laborers, or, their whole way of life gets changed because of this. So,
once you do research for something like this, and you're a historian and you look at the history between, the different tribes in South Africa, does it make you understand the relationships between South Africans today any better?
I think it does, because, look, if you like, land is really a major issue. And the question is, who's got the land? Whose is the land? And who should it belong to? Well, probably the Khoisan, in fact, because, I mean, everyone else, apart from the San, I mean, the Khoi, everyone else actually came into this country at some stage.
And they are the most displaced people in the country.
Exactly. So everybody in this country is in fact a settler in that sense, apart from the San.
Yeah.
So now, of course, it's a question of who takes over from whom, and we're left with this historical situation where you have a settler control over the African population, but so this whole movement is absolutely vital to understanding how we deal with it today, actually. I mean, because where does one actually go to be absolutely fair about all of this?
Yes. It's never been fair.
And it can't be. And it is an historical process, and it's something that's actually happened, and we have to deal with it. But I think if we understand how it happened, we can perhaps deal with it with more understanding, with a better perspective.
We're moving towards a world where war is not the driving force behind everything we do, where violence isn't there. But the world is born out of war, I almost want to say.
Yeah.
The European boundaries were set by wars.
Absolutely.
The South African boundary and the African boundaries are set by war.
Well, I mean, at the moment you've got a special operation in the Ukraine.
In the Ukraine, yes.
Or do we call it an invasion? You know, I mean,
Or do we call it settlers?
Or do we call it settlers? Or do we call it a colonial enterprise? I mean, you know, all of these things are still very much alive.
Just history repeating itself again and again.
Yeah.
John, in your book, The Boer Invasion of the Zulu Kingdom, if people read it, what do you think would they be most surprised about? What are some of those facts that would you think surprised them?
Yeah. I think, in a way, I've tried to understand the Zulu perspective more thoroughly. So in other words, I think one of the most emotive issues, of course, is the killing of Piet Retief and his party in Mgungundlovu. And I think if one understands what the Zulu were thinking...
The thought process behind it.
But, yeah, I mean, what were the options? What sort of threat did they perceive? How did they think they could actually get rid of this? I mean, because think of it this way. You're not imagining thousands and thousands and thousands of settlers coming in. Your horizon is simply of a smallish party. If you can get rid of them, that's probably the end of the problem. You know, no more people will be coming. I mean, this whole period in Southern Africa of people on the move, you know, the whole business. I mean, so there are these small groups moving around, being displaced. The Boers, the Voortrekkers, were simply one of those groups as well.
Those groups in Southern Africa looking for a place.
Looking for a place. And, you know, and the whole point about Southern Africa, I mean, the areas where you can actually grow your crops, where you can find water, where you can graze your cattle, are very limited. I mean, you know, most of this subcontinent actually is not much use, you know, for those kind of activities. So there are these sweet spots everywhere, and that's what people are contending for. And the Zulu Kingdom area was very much a sweet spot.
Referring to the Zulu Kingdom, in a previous interview you said the Zulu history is so intriguing. You find it so intriguing. You've always been intrigued by it, but you want to spend more time analyzing it and digging deeper into the history. Yeah. How do you do that? Because there's the written history records of the Zulu tradition and the Zulu history is obviously a little more limited, I'd expect.
Yeah. Well, all right, they're the observers, if you like, who are settlers, colonists, etc. They report and all the rest of it. And, you know, but what's been hugely important in this is a thing called the James Stewart Archive of Recorded Evidence. I mean, this was an incredible magistrate at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, in that part of the world, who made it his life's ambition, his life's work, to interview hundreds and hundreds of Zulu people about the history of their country. And many of these people were, of course, at that stage, there'd been young people at the time of the Great Trek. You know, they'd lived through it, or their parents had lived through it. So this kind of oral testimony is hugely important. So we do have a huge collection, in fact, of Zulu memory of what had actually happened historically, which has been recorded. So when I work with it, I use the James Stewart Archive heavily because that's actually the best kind of source we have. I mean, obviously, Zulus remember it. There's oral tradition. People talk about it. And you talk to people and they'll tell you about it. But this is generations and generations further on. The James Stewart Archive, this is almost first-hand memory of what actually was happening. So one digs deeply into that.
I can't wait for a publication of that to come out, because that's going to be fascinating. But I must say, this has been, don't want to say, it was a read that caught me unawares and informed me about certain angles of viewpoints of the history that I wasn't even thinking about. People get irritated by that. How do you cope with it?
Well, it works two ways. I mean, people are irritated. All right, shall we say, seeing problems with, if you like, the Afrikaner mythology, but then you'll get Zulu speakers saying, "You're a white guy. How can you actually talk about us either?"
On the other side as well.
I mean, who am I? People say, to actually write about any of this. And one's answer is, as an historian, you are trying to use the evidence as best you can. You know that you have your own background, your biases and all the rest of it, but you're trying to make an even-handed history. I'm not trying to write a political polemic.
Political view.
I'm trying to say, okay, as far as I see it,
Factual.
this is what happened. But another historian will come along after me and he'll say, no, well, you got it wrong, you misinterpreted, you gave it the wrong sort of emphasis.
Yeah.
You know, that's how it works.
John, it is a lovely read. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you so much for chatting with us this morning about it.
It's been a great pleasure.
And I'd advise everyone to go and read this just for a little bit of background, more information. Thank you so much for om saam te kuier vanmôre was lekker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nou ja, gaan lees die boek. Kom nou. Groei borshare, lees hom. Dis goeie inligting en dis reg dat jy bietjie dinge sien op dalk 'n meer gebalanseerde manier. Dis dan die boek The Boer Invasion of the Zulu Kingdom.